Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. My name is Ben. I'm a researcher with the Borders in Globalization project. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwegen people in the Salish Sea region. Today, we are going to talk about history of cross-border cooperation in Europe since 1945 with Birte Wassenberg, professor in contemporary history at the Institute for Political Studies of the University of Strasbourg in France. Welcome on board, Birte Wassenberg. It's great to see you.
Yeah, hello.
As we know, Birte, the borders reflects a division of the world into territorialized state, legal and political orders that are spatially separated by territorial delimitations. Cross-border cooperation connects local and subnational authorities on both sides and across borders. This phenomenon, in fact, challenges both the monopoly of external actions of the state and the nature of the legal limit of borders for subnational actions. Before getting into substance of this topic, I wanted to make a quick detour on a matter of terminology. What is cross-border cooperation? And is there a difference between the expressions transboundary cooperation and cross-border cooperation, or the two expressions have the same meaning?
I would say that in Europe, we normally use rather the term of cross-border cooperation, since it's also translated from other languages like grenzüberschreitende Zusammenarbeit in German, for example, or Kooperation transfrontalière. Transboundary cooperation, I would say, is less used. Sometimes it's used in the scientific literature, and more, I would say, by the Anglophone researchers. I don't think that the theoretical differentiation made between these two terms. But there is, however, another term which is used increasingly in Europe, which is territorial cooperation. And territorial cooperation has been introduced by the European Commission with the social and cohesion policy. And as you can see from the term, the border there has disappeared. So this has I would say, an implication in terms of meaning, because territorial means that we want to get rid of the border. Whereas if we say transboundary or cross-border, it means the way that we cross the border, that we overcome the border. That's the important term. And this is why I prefer the term transborder or cross-border to the term of territorial cooperation. I prefer the expression cross-border or transboundary, but we usually in Europe use cross-border. And I prefer largely cross-border because territorial means that it's ideological in a way. You want the border to disappear. It's no longer in the term. Whereas cross-border means that you have to overcome the border. And I believe that cross-border cooperation is all about overcoming borders and not about getting rid of them, really, at least not getting rid of them completely. And this is why I prefer cross-border cooperation as a term. But the European Union uses increasingly nowadays no longer cross-border, but territorial cooperation.
Okay, I understand better. Thank you, Birte. This different terminology can make things very confusing sometimes.
Yeah.
I have now a very general historical question. In the long and complex development of cross-border cooperation in Europe, is it possible to identify several historical phases in the history of this phenomenon since 1945? How has the phenomenon of cross-border cooperation evolved over time?
Another small comment on the terminology. When you talk about cross-border cooperation, you also have to add other terminologies like, for example, interregional cooperation, where you have different regions cooperating, not necessarily separated by a border. And you also have to add the coopération décentralisée, decentered cooperation, which is largely used in France to designate cooperation of local and regional authorities with north-south cooperation with states in Africa and Asia, for example, to do development policy on the local scale. So territorial cooperation, just to complete the terminology, englobes also all these terms: decentered, cross-border, interregional, whereas cross-border is really specific about cooperation on the border itself. That's just to complete because when you said confusing, yes, because there are also other terminologies that you have to kind of put all together in order to be able to understand really what you mean by cross-border cooperation. When I come to the history now, cross-border cooperation has, yes, there are phases that you can identify in cross-border cooperation, I would say, from the end of the Second World War. But you could also, I mean, I'm a historian who is specialized in the post-45 period, but you can also identify cross-border cooperation beforehand, for example, in the interwar period in Europe. But normally when we talk about cross-border cooperation as a phenomenon of wanting to get to an integrated cross-border space and to complement the process of European integration, then I would say that we can say, yes, we start in 45, and when the process of European integration starts, and I would say there is a first phase from 45 to the 70s, which is a phase in which we have cross-border cooperation developing in certain border regions in Western Europe, mainly in the founding member states of the European Community, for example, between France and Germany, but also in the Benelux states. And these cooperations are initiated by local actors, very often more local than regional actors like towns, but also sometimes some regions or départements. And they do a rather informal cooperation, and they start to institutionalize also this cooperation, but under the form of private associations, which are very informal, but which have one thing in common with the European integration process, is that one of the objectives of this cross-border cooperation is to promote peace in Europe and to bring the populations from one side and the other together in the border regions after the atrocities of the Second World War. So this is something which happens mainly in Western Europe, 45 to 70. But then we have a problem in the 70s of cross-border cooperation being identified by the states as a problem. This has happened, for example, in the cross-border regions between France and Germany. The French state suddenly realized that there are local actors doing foreign policy with the Germans, and this poses a legal problem because the local actors have no competence in foreign policy. And so the 1970s are marked from the 1970s until, I would say, the 1990s. We have a phase of, I have called this a legitimation of cross-border cooperation, or in institutionalization, a legal framework given to cross-border cooperation throughout Europe by the national states. The national states legitimize cross-border cooperation by concluding bilateral or trilateral treaties, intergovernmental treaties. And these treaties put the cross-border cooperation of local and regional actors into a certain framework. This has not happened for all border regions in Europe, but for those who have initiated cross-border cooperation in the 50s and 60s, this has started happening in the 1970s. And the main actor on the European level was the Council of Europe, which has adopted in 1980 a framework convention on cross-border cooperation. And this framework convention is kind of the European legal framework for legitimizing cross-border cooperation of local and regional actors. I would say there's a third phase of cross-border cooperation starting from the 1990s. This is very marked by the introduction by the European Commission of the Interreg program, which creates a link between local and regional actors in Europe and the European Union. And the European Commission, it's done in the framework of the regional policy. It also makes the local and regional actors at the borders contribute to the project of the single European market. So from then on, cross-border cooperation contributes to the European integration by means of the social and cohesion policy, regional policy, cohesion policy. And it's also a phase in the 1990s because of this program when we have a generalization of cross-border cooperation throughout Europe. We have at the one side the regions in Western Europe or in Northern Europe that had not so much engaged on cross-border cooperation, which also now do interact. For example, Spain, France, or Denmark, Germany. But we also have, of course, all the Eastern and Central European regions who, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, can also contribute to cross-border cooperation, and they are also supported by the European Union. So this is, for me, from the 1990s, is a third phase, and I would add another phase of cross-border cooperation in the from 2004 onwards, when the European Union has introduced the European neighborhood policy, because at that point, I think that cross-border cooperation in Europe acquires a geopolitical function, because with the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, there is now not longer just the objective of cross-border cooperation to contributing to the single European market, but also to contributing to good neighborhood relations with external states. For example, Belarus or Russia or Ukraine. This is a different type of cross-border cooperation and the different objectives, because these countries not all want to join, or some of them never would join the European Union. So it's a question of good neighborhood relations, also of stability of borders in Europe, and the contribution of this cross-border cooperation to this stability and democratic stability in Europe, as the Council of Europe has put it. That's in the 2000s. And if we want to add a last phase of cross-border cooperation, we might add a phase from 2015 onwards, which is a phase of crisis, because from 2015 onwards, with the terrorist and migration crisis, and later on with the COVID crisis, we have a phase of rebordering in Europe, and so cross-border cooperation is put into question in border regions in the European Union, and there's the question of how these local and regional actors react to the rebordering and how they show or do not show resilience. So I would say we are now in a new phase of cross-border cooperation, which is still a phase of crisis, maybe cross-border cooperation in crisis 2015 to today. That's what I would identify as phases in cross-border cooperation.
Thank you, Birte. Wow. A quote is well known throughout the world of border studies, namely, borders are scars of history. This quotation is often used to justify the existence of cross-border cooperation in Europe. But where does this phrase come from? Borders are scars of history.
So borders are scars of history. This comes from Alfred Moser, who was one of the pioneers of cross-border cooperation at the Dutch-German border. He was Dutch and German. He had both nationalities, opted for the finally for the Dutch nationality after the Second World War. And he was working for the first European Commission of Walter Hallstein in the 1950s. And he so was an actor in European integration, the first steps of European integration with the common market. And he realized that maybe what has happened on the European level should also be put in the border regions. And as he was originally from the border region between Germany and Netherlands in Gronau. He's one of the founders of the first Euregio in Gronau at that border. He identified the borders as the scars of history, which should not be eliminated, as he said, but should be overcome. And this was then later on always quoted by specialists in the history, but also specialists of cross-border cooperation in general, to give this cross-border cooperation kind of motive or a motivation and an objective. Scars of history, because at the borders it's where the wars have created a lot of sufferance, where the borders are drawn is often very arbitrary, so the populations sometimes are displaced. The sufferance at the border itself is often very hard, and so you can identify them as a kind of scar of history, and the scar is the image that you have to heal this separation which has been created by the wars and by the arbitrary tracing of borders in Europe. So that was his quotation, has been taken up again afterwards, for example, also by other pioneers of cross-border cooperation. And so there are sometimes different personalities that are quoted. Also, Viktor von Malchus, for example, has reused it, but at the origin, it was Alfred Moser in the 1950s who used it for the first time.
Thank you, Birte, for these precisions. You spoke about Viktor von Malchus, and in a 1972 report, named the Cooperation of European Frontier Regions, Viktor von Malchus listed the objectives of what he calls supra-frontier cooperation. Who is the author, and what is his contribution to the development of cross-border cooperation? What do you think about him?
So Viktor von Malchus, he was one of the founders of the Association for European Border Regions, which was founded in 1971. He is German, and he was also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and he lobbied very much in the Council of Europe for the creation of a conference of regional authorities, because there had been in the 50s already a conference of local authorities, and this has been then enlarged in 1975 to a conference of local and regional authorities. And Viktor von Malchus, together with others in the Parliamentary Assembly and in the Council of Europe, they were organizing what they called some conferences, called a confrontation of regional confrontations, where they talked a lot about space planning. He was very specialized in space planning, and so the first reports about problems of cross-border regions that were presented in the Council of Europe were on these problems, economic problems of border regions, which were often identified at the beginning as problematic regions because they were at the periphery and they had a lot of problems of regional development. So that's the origin of this. And the 1972 report was one report, but there were others that were then introduced in the Council of Europe, and they finally, in fact, led to the introduction of this idea of a framework convention on cross-border cooperation in 1981 in the Council of Europe.
Thank you, Birte, for that answer. Yeah, this topic of cross-border cooperation is very dense, very rich, very complex. We spoke about different terminologies. We spoke about different phases, different actors. It's very complex and very interesting topic. Let us now move on the complex domain on the one hand of the actors. You spoke about the Council of Europe, but let's speak now about the actors of cross-border cooperation and on the other hand of the tools of cross-border cooperation. Firstly, Birte, what are the different actors involved in the phenomenon of cross-border cooperation?
Okay, this is also a very large question. Generally, we say that in Europe, we put an emphasis on local and regional actors because this is the specificity of cross-border cooperation in Europe, and which has started, in fact, in the after the Second World War, first with the twin towns. That's when they started to build up cross-border associations. So we really put an emphasis on these subnational actors. But these are not, I mean, they are not only public actors, not only towns or regions or local and regional authorities, but there are also private actors. We have, for example, chambers of commerce that have been extremely dynamic also in cross-border cooperation. Sometimes we have also enterprises, firms that are cooperating. We have also, for example, trade unions or corporations and associations. So we have even a link to the civil society, and we can decline the cross-border cooperation right to the citizens, if you like. And then we also have to take into account when we talk about actors, that when we talk about infranational actors, there is a whole variety of these actors in Europe because each state has a different administrative organization. And if I take, for example, Germany as a case study, for example, in Germany, we have we have cities, but we have also communes that are put together in a larger conglomeration that can also be actors of cross-border cooperation. Then we have the Länder, which are federal states. They are states, but they're still subnational because they're not on the federal level, but below the federal level. So we do have a lot of different regional actors that we have to take into account. And then I insist that normally you can, in a lot of cases, not do cross-border cooperation either without the national states. If we take, for example, the case of France, which is a very highly centralized state, if we contractualize cross-border cooperation, in the end, you always have the state represented via, for example, the regional representation of the préfecture, or even the national state coming from somebody from a ministry in Paris, or even the Quai d'Orsay, the foreign minister. So in fact, what I would say the richness of cross-border cooperation is that we have a multitude of actors involved in Europe. And the specificity of Europe with regard to other regions in the world, if we compare it, for example, to America or to Asia, is that we have these this dynamic intervention of subnational entities, public and private ones, that are really largely, and especially public ones, that are largely involved in cross-border cooperation. And I have to add a last actor, which we must not forget, and which is due to the process of European integration. There are also European actors in cross-border cooperation, especially the European Union, European Commission, but also the Parliament nowadays, the Committee of Regions. There's also the Council of Europe, the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, and we have European groupings, the Association for European Border Regions, for example, and these are actors that intervene on a European level. So there's a high complexity also of, I would say, a multi-level actor constellation in Europe.
Yeah, I think it's a good name, constellation of different actors. Okay, there are many tools also for cross-border cooperation. We just spoke about the actors, but let's now speak a little bit about the tools for cross-border cooperation. Of course, we cannot present everything today in this podcast. And we will talk later about the specific case of the European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation, or EGTC. But in the 70s and in the 80s, cross-border cooperation saw the development of many working communities, as the working community of the Central Alps or for the Pyrenees. And some of these working communities have evolved in their status and have become Euroregions. Could you tell us a word about these two types of cross-border institutions?
Well, here again, we have we have to clarify the terminology. In fact, you cannot say really that a working community in the Euroregion is necessarily something different. What we have to distinguish in when we talk about tools, or I would say like institutionalized cross-border cooperation, is the degree of institutionalization. A lot of working groups, sometimes like the working community of the Central Alps, they are, or the Pyrenees from the 70s and 80s, they started as informal groups with no legal basis. They were not even constituted as an association. They were just a working group, and they had no formal basis to it was just an agreement between the actors to meet and to talk about issues of cross-border problems. Whereas later on, I mean, in the 1960s, I mean, already in the 1960s in Western Europe, but increasingly also in the 1990s, then later on, the local actors in some regions went beyond these working groups and said, we want to have something more formal. And they then created associations, but they were private associations. That's, for example, the Regio Basiliensis. The Regio Basiliensis is not called an Euregio, it's called an Regio, but it's in fact, if you like, the same thing, because Euregios The main number of Euroregions, you can find them in Central and Eastern Europe. They were actually created in the 1990s by the Central and Eastern local and regional authorities, who really wanted to show their willingness to participate in European integration. So they were forming these associations. They called them Euroregions, and that was a designation a little bit with an ideologic behind. Let's say we are a Euroregion. We want to be pro-European. That's why they call them Euroregions. In France, you do not have one single Euroregion because the term Euroregion is problematic. The French state doesn't like it because you could qualify it as being secessionist or regionalist. If you look at, for example, the Catalan region, fearing that maybe there could be a separatist movement to against the state, so the French authorities do not like Euroregion. But however you call it, Regio, Euregio, or any other designation, these are all private associations. And later on, we have also some more some public legal basis, which are used for cross-border institutions. And as you have the legal basis from the European Union is the European Grouping for Territorial Cooperation, but that was only created in 2008. And we had some other legal basis that we could use beforehand. For example, in our cross-border regions, for example, there was also the European Economic Association. I mean, this is or grouping. This was used by, for example, for an institution here, the Euro Institute, which wanted to have a more formalized public legal basis, but it was normally something foreseen for the private sector. But they are still now based on this economic grouping. Then there was also when in the cases where we have bilateral or trilateral treaties, we had, for example, the Karlsruhe Agreement here between Luxembourg, Switzerland, Germany, and France, and they in 1996. And when they this treaty created the possibility of a transnational legal basis, which was called the cross-border grouping. It has been also used by some of the institutions here, and nowadays these different tools are actually replaced by the European tool, which is the EGTC. So I would say that if you want to make a differentiation, is on one side, we have a public institutionalized legal framework, EGTC, for example. On the other side, we have a more informal way of cooperating, working groups, or even private associations, because private law is not the same and it's much more flexible.
Wow, thank you very much for this presentation of this high level of complexity and diversity between the different tools. You spoke multiple times about this European Outline Convention on Transfrontier Cooperation between Territorial Communities or Authorities, also called the Madrid Convention. An author like Ivo Dušasek had already been able to speak of transboundary regionalism or global micro-diplomacy in his 1986 book, The Territorial Dimension of Politics Within, Among, and Across Nations. So my question is this one, Birte. How can we define a cross-border region? And also, what are the factors, the most important factors in the emergence of cross-border institutions?
Okay, transborder regionalism, I would say micro-diplomacy or transborder regionalism has a more political outset or objective. It's putting together local or regional actors across the border in order to defend common political objectives. So it could be, for example, to gain more money in Interreg programs, but it could also be more political. For example, I talked about the Catalan region to have, more independence from the state. So this is, micro diplomacy is something that is much more political. When you talk about a cross-border region, I think you can say it's not necessarily behind this is not necessarily the idea to create an independent or state-independent entity. A cross-border region is, for me, more a space in which regional, local, or other actors cooperate and cooperate on a permanent basis, because the population is on one side and the other of the border, and we need to develop tools to cross the borders and to develop projects and to create if you like, a sort of common living space. So I would put cross-border region a little bit more on the field not of politics, but more on the field of space planning, having a common cross-border space, a transnational space, or also maybe on the level of creating links. Permanent links between political actors in the region, between economic actors in the region, and between also on the in the framework of the population. And and cross-border institutions are created in order to maintain this permanent link or to structure it. You can have this on a political level. You can, for example, create institutions, governance institutions, which, for example, reunite the presidents of the regions or the executives of the regional authorities. You can also have this on the level of the towns, of the cities, when you have, for example, a framework in which the mayors, border cities meet. We have, if I give two examples of my region, the Upper Rhine region has the cross-border Upper Rhine Conference, where we have the regional authorities, the presidents of the regions meeting, of the Länder and the cantons, and we have also the Euro district Strasbourg-Kehl, where we have the mayor of Strasbourg, Kehl, and the Autenau, who are in a political framework linked together. These institutions often have been fortified from the 1990s onwards with common secretariats. They are kind of, I call them always mini European commissions that are put into place in the cross-border regions in order to assure that the political decisions on what we are doing for the cross-border region are also implemented on an administrative level. So these common secretariats make sure that the cross-border activities are then implemented. And so you have you also have to underline that there are a whole multitude and variety of cross-border institutions throughout Europe. Not one is like the other, because each cross-border region has its own history of cross-border cooperation, and so it has its own cross-border institutions that take into account the history and also the specificity of the political and historical and economic context of the regions, and that can be very different. The only common institutions that you do have in Europe are the Interreg secretariats, which are also cross-border institutions, because the European Commission has insisted on harmonizing or having a common approach to these institutions. So each European region has an Interreg secretariat, which is kind of similar, and it's also a cross-border institution. This is also making an emphasis on building this cross-border region via common projects, and that can be bridges over the river of the Rhine, for example, but it can also be projects in transport, in environmental protection, in cultural cooperation, lots of different spheres of the public life.
Many thanks, Birte. We spoke about different actors, we spoke about different tools. Let's now speak about the different challenges for our audience. What are the main challenges of the cross-border cooperation and cross-border relations? Is it still, and I'm sure it depends of the nature, the legal nature of each state, but is it still and always this category of national sovereignty over foreign affairs and international relations? This notion of sovereignty could be a huge obstacle for the cross-border relation. Yes or not?
I think it's not really I don't think the challenge is to abolish national sovereignty and replace it with regional sovereignty. That would be, the Europe of the regions, and let's get rid of the national states. There has been an approach to cross-border cooperation in the past, but I don't think this is the real challenge nowadays. What we do have, the challenge is more how to implement multi-level governance for cross-border cooperation, where we do take into account a European level of governance, meaning the EU, a national governance, meaning the national states, and the regional governance, meaning the competences of the regions. And I might also add the last level is the one of the towns or the local authorities. And in this multi-level governance, the Treaty of Maastricht has in fact introduced in 1992 this idea of a principle of subsidiarity, meaning that each level has to intervene where it can best, it is best or is most efficient in implementing activities. And that's the idea of subsidiarity. And it's also the idea of having it, if possible, each activity implemented in the most closest level to the citizen. This puts a big emphasis on the necessity to associate more the regions and the towns into public policy. And this is something that the local and regional actors have actually in Europe acquired as a right, because since the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, the principle of subsidiarity can be actually put before the European Court. So if the European Union does not associate, or the national states in Brussels, if they do not associate the regions, for example, for the cohesion policy, then the regions can go before the court and claim that they should be able to participate in the decision-making process. So the question is, how do we divide the roles? Who is doing what in cross-border cooperation? And I can best illustrate this challenge with the COVID crisis. In the COVID crisis, we had a phenomenon of rebordering, which was not done by the European Union, but because the competence was mainly on the national states. So the national states introduced a sudden and abrupt rebordering. This disrupted immensely the life of cross-border regions and of integrated cross-border spaces. And the cross-border actors, the cross-border institutions, but also the regional and local authorities had not been associated to this decision-making process of bordering. And this has been remarked in the COVID crisis because it has created a lot of problems in the border regions. Serious problems of separation of families, of a problem for cross-border workers. And so in some border regions, as a reaction, they have now created groups, working groups, where they do put national authorities together with the regional authorities so that there can be a common response to crisis, for example. And that is a big challenge because it means that you have to make the national authorities understand, not abolish sovereignty, but to make them understand if you are taking a decision this decision, like the bordering decision, might affect our border regions, particularly and in a way that you have not thought about. And that might be extremely difficult for the border regions, but not for the rest of the countries. And so with this idea of the specificity of the border spaces and the necessity to be associated to the national decision-making procedure, you can then create a kind of level of discussion where you avoid a disruption, for example, of integrated spaces. This is a big challenge. Another challenge for cross-border cooperation is also, and they call this in Europe, the European mechanism, which for the moment is unfortunately blocked at the European Union by some of the member states. The European mechanism takes on the challenge of what do we do if we have more and more important cross-border projects that do touch on the sovereignty of the state, for example, in the health sector, or if we want to create a a hospital, a binational hospital, for example, that has been created between France and Spain. It exists, but this poses a lot of legal problems because the law stops at the border. And the European mechanism, the challenge is that it envisages taking the national law across the border and applying national law on the other side of the border. That means that the national state has to give up sovereignty in one area, functional area, for example, for the hospital or for a tramway, in order to facilitate the cross-border project. And that is a real challenge. And the national states for the moment resist this because they do not want to give up this sovereignty. There is this, that's a challenge. It means that the more you integrate border regions, the more you come to this limit of legal and administrative borders, and you have to try and find a way how to deal with these problems of sovereignty. And one solution would be the mechanism. Another solution is mutual recognition. The legal experts always call for mutual recognition. If you recognize the mutually the law on the other side, you might not even need to export law on the other side of the border. The last challenge, and this is not this is probably a very, very important one, is also we mustn't forget about the mental borders that can exist in border regions. That's a real challenge for cross-border cooperation. We are in a phase where we do have more and more of Euroscepticism. We have more and more of populist, nationalist, xenophobic movements, political movements that do not go in favor of European integration and that do not go in favor of cross-border cooperation. And in order to avoid a drawback of the cross-border cooperation and of the integrated border spaces, we have to make sure that there is still an understanding of the population, and we have an intercultural understanding. In many border regions, for example, regional languages disappear. So there are new language barriers also. So we must make sure that the people in the border regions continue to understand each other and to also to communicate, to work together, and to in a European and a cross-border context. And so this has been something that has been revealed also with the COVID crisis, because there has been a lot of ressentiment against cross-border workers, which put into question this period of which we have had of Franco-German or European reconciliation. So be aware of the mental borders and not fall back in the advancement of cross-border cooperation, because people become more nationalistic and they do no longer want to cooperate with their neighbors.
Thank you, Birte, for this great overview of the different challenges. The statistics speak for themselves. 40% of the European territory are border regions. 1/3 of the European population lives in border regions. Now, here's a question that connects geography and history. If we could look to the European continent and the EU member states, which European borders are the most dynamic in terms of cross-border cooperation? Are there historical reasons for this dynamism?
That's a very, very good question. I would say, I mean, you have to be very careful, because how do you define dynamic cross-border cooperation? Historically speaking, of course, the most dynamic border regions are those that have started the cross-border cooperation early in the history. And that's, for example, the Greater Region, alongside the Franco-German border, Greater Region, Upper Rhine region, but also in the whole of the Benelux states. That's kind of the core of cross-border cooperation, where we have really a strong history. And this has led also to a lot of cross-border projects during the Interreg periods, because there had already been so many links and cooperation that the actors could use this and build on this experience in order to then implement cross-border projects. But as I said before, in the 1990s, the cross-border cooperation has been enlarged. And we have also, if you look, for example, at the map of Euroregions, you would say the most dynamic, or of EGTCs, the most dynamic regions in Europe are not the Western European regions of the founding member states of the European community, but rather the Eastern European regions at the border between, for example, Germany and Poland, or even in between the Czech Republic and Poland, or around Hungary. Most of the EGTCs are in Hungary, around Hungary. So Euroregions dynamics have been very, very much have I would say doubled in terms of development from the 90s until now, and they are much more important now than in Western Europe. So it depends on the criteria you use. If you can also say, for example, measure the dynamics of cross-border cooperation by means of cross-border institutions. Here again, you will find most institutions in Western Europe, but this is also due to I would say the political culture and tradition, because they like formalized cooperation. If you look, for example, United Kingdom and Ireland, the region of Northern Ireland, there are not a lot of formal structures, but they do have a very dynamic cross-border cooperation in terms also of implementation of the peace programs from the 1990s, which have actually helped to overcome the conflict in Northern Ireland. So this has also been very dynamic, but you cannot see it on a map if you measure it with institutions. You can see it if you measure it with, for example, projects of peace programs or Interreg projects. So it really depends on the criteria you use, because it's also a question of how dense the population is in cross-border regions. If you take, for example, France, and you take the town of Lille, this is of course a very it's a metropole, and so around metropoles, the cross-border cooperation is, of course, very dynamic. If you take rural areas in, for example, Scandinavia, you will have, of course, a lot of less cross-border cooperation in terms of, institutions or in terms of projects, because there are just less people living there. And then you also have to take into account, of course, all the historical past of the border regions, and there you can also say that there are some border regions which have difficulties. For example, if you take the border region between Germany and Denmark, I mean, historically speaking, this has been a very there are minorities on each side of the border, and so the cross-border cooperation has not been evident. It is there, but it is I would say that it suffers from the difficult past in the region, and this is an explanation why maybe it's not so dynamic as, for example, cooperation between Germany and France. So really, we can say that historically speaking, we have a benefit of the core countries of the European community in Western Europe. But nowadays, cross-border cooperation, as you said, it has spread so much thanks to the Interreg programs, and it has diversified. And so I would say that we find cross-border cooperation now everywhere in the European Union, and we mustn't forget also the external cooperation at the external borders, which is an extremely important cooperation. You cannot see it in terms of institutions, but you can see it if you look at good neighborhood relations and, for example, at the common effort to combat cross-border crime or drug trafficking, smuggling, human trafficking. These are very difficult questions, and even if maybe you cannot measure it so easily in terms of the number of projects, still, if you have less crime, or if you have a more stable border to the external border, then you can say yes, this has been a very efficient cross-border cooperation.
Thank you, Birte. You just spoke quickly about France. Let's take now an example of a case study of a particular country. Let's take this example of France, which is a very interesting case. France was an archetypal model of a unitary state. But today, the Article 1 of the Constitution provides that the organization of the French Republic is decentralized. In France, as you have said, the history of cross-border cooperation has seen an evolution in the terminology. We have gone from the expression decentralized cooperation, created by a law of 1992, to the expression external action of local authorities, in particular since the law of 2014. My question is this one, Birte. What has been the evolution of French policy in terms of cross-border and history of the cross-border cooperation?
Yes, I mean, if you take France, it's an interesting case because I would say that the cross-border cooperation has started in France very informally by the willingness of some local and regional actors to cooperate with their neighbors. The centralized France of the 1960s and 70s was not able to institutionalize cross-border cooperation in terms of public cross-border cooperation, even in this border region, for example, between France, Germany, and Switzerland. The local authorities, the départements, were not associated to official cross-border structures until the 1990s. But in fact, we can say it like this: the cross-border cooperation with the neighbors has helped these local and regional actors to acquire more and more competences for small foreign policy, as I have identified this together with Martin Klatt, meaning that the French state in Paris has realized throughout the history with the border regions that they have an interest in allowing local and regional authorities to cooperate with their neighbors, because this helps the French state to facilitate relationships with their neighbors in terms of Germany, for example, but also to facilitate more complex neighborhood relations, for example, between Guyana and Brazil. And the French state has therefore, and this is why we have this change from decentralization towards also external action of local and regional authorities. The French state has realized that it is beneficial for the state to allow the local and regional authorities to cooperate more and also on with some legal competences with their neighbors, because this helps the French state to be able to implement their foreign policy. I always say that the cross-border cooperation supports the foreign policy of the state, and in France this is definitely the case. No cross-border cooperation has been initiated in France against the French state, and so there has been a learning effect of the French authorities in Paris, who were maybe afraid of giving competences to local authorities in any way, towards saying yes, we are. It can be beneficial to let them contribute to cross-border cooperation, and I think that the European integration process has also helped France to understand this, because in the European Union we have states that are federations: Belgium, Austria, Germany, and in these states we have subnational units who are states and who have a right to participate in foreign policy. And so in the European Union we have this principle of subsidiarity, we have the Committee of Regions, and so we have this idea of multi-level governance. And so with the link that has been established between cross-border cooperation and the European Union in the 1990s, I think the French state has also understood that in the European Union there needs to be some space for the local and regional authorities to cooperate, not necessarily just cross-border, but even on the European level. So I think the history of France is a history of understanding that that local and regional actors can contribute to the national foreign policy.
Thank you, Birte, for this overview about the French history and the challenges for this country when we spoke about cross-border relations. You spoke about that during this interview. Official documents speak of several types of cooperation across border. You spoke about territorial cooperation, like the umbrella concept. Inside this expression of territorial cooperation, we have the cross-border cooperation, we have the transnational cooperation, and we have the interregional cooperation. Everything now is linked inside this new concept of territorial cooperation. And this concept of territorial cooperation, of course, is linked with the new tool of the European grouping of territorial cooperation. But my question focuses on this history of the EGTC. The first EGTC was the Lille-Kortrijk Tournai Eurometropolis in January 2008. So it's like 15 years ago. What is the specific place of the EGTC in the history and the future of cross-border cooperation?
I think that the EGTC is a very useful tool because it has the advantage of being European. It counts for all the member states of the European Union. So it's a unique tool, legal tool for cross-border cooperation. And it has been is extremely useful when you need a strong legal basis for cross-border projects or cross-border institutions. A good example for this is I've talked about the hospital at Sardinia between France and Spain, which is in Spain. If you do not have a legal basis like the EGTC for such a common institution, this is legally extremely difficult because in a hospital you die, you give birth. There are legally very difficult questions that can arise in such a common binational institution. So the more you integrate, the more you need these common legal bases because they give you a security and they give you also an existence in terms of legal existence for your cross-border structures. But I have also this is very useful, and also another advantage is also that this guarantees a continuity, because if you have these legal bases, that means that you institutionalize, and that means that you that the cross-border cooperation no longer depends on the willingness of certain people, but that it becomes a structure with a legal basis which is there, and the people then come and go. But the structure itself ensures that cross-border cooperation will last. But still, I am of the opinion that it is best to have an EGTC at the end of the process and not at the beginning of a process. But this is apart from institutions like the hospital, where you definitely need it from the start. Why do I say this? It's because, in my opinion, cross-border cooperation lives still and foremost from the dynamic of the actors that are in the border regions, and so you must make cross-border cooperation live by the people, and it can be the politicians, can be the civil society. So it cannot be this cross-border cooperation, the willingness to work together cannot be replaced by a legal structure. And this you can prove because you can see a lot of EGTCs throughout Europe. We have once investigated into this with my colleague Bernhard Reitel, and we have discovered that a lot of the EGTCs are still there, but there is nothing happening. For example, in some Euroregions in Eastern and Central Europe or in the Balkans, they exist. There is this structure, but there is nothing happening. And this is what happens when you rely too much on legal structures instead on the dynamics of the actors and of the people who actually implement the cross-border cooperation. So for me, the EGTC is a tool, but it cannot replace the objective and the dynamic of and the willingness of the people to actually practice cross-border cooperation.
Thank you, Birte. In 2020, you published a book entitled Critical Dictionary and Cross-Border Cooperation in Europe. In this very important book, we could read a lot of documents and a lot of articles about the cross-border strategies, about the cross-border public services, also about the B-Solution initiative from the EU and the famous ECBM, the European Cross-Border Mechanism. So a lot of new tools, a lot of new reflections, and a lot of new progress in the cross-border history, the history of cross-border cooperation. Connected to the topic of the EGTC, some authors reflect on the idea of a European administrative law for cross-border cooperation. Could we see this new trend about building an administrative law at the European level or at the interlocal level as a new phase of the history of cross-border cooperation? What do you think about this trend?
I'm not a legal specialist, but I think, I mean, knowing and working a lot with the legal specialists here, is that you have already a lot of legal tools. You have European law, which you can, if you want to have something for cross-border cooperation which counts for the whole of Europe, you can adopt a European directive or a decision, which will be then implemented at European EU level. You have the national law, and you have also the idea, as you have just mentioned, of the European mechanism, which would mean that you can maybe, if that's at one point is adopted, but it may be adopted actually in the framework of the Franco-German Treaty of Aachen, where it also is foreseen, this using national law on the other side of the border. I do not think that you will have a European cross-border law. I mean, a lot of people have always in the past dreamt of a cross-border law. But if you want to have cross-border law, then you would have to do what the European Union has done at the start. You would have to create cross-border institutions where the partners give up sovereignty and kind of create almost a mini state in the border region, where they adopt legal initiatives together. And I can't see this happening because the legal the competences of the regions in Europe are just too different and too it could be maybe done by federal states, but still, even then, because they have legal competences, but they have no cross-border law doesn't exist. So I mean, we could maybe imagine between Switzerland and Germany a cross-border institution where the cantons and Länder decide that they give up sovereignty for the cross-border workers, and they decide, now we have a cross-border law and we will install a cross-border court, and the cross-border court will implement the law, and the law will count on cross-border issues. But you imagine the difficulty, first of all, Switzerland not being part of the European Union, should have maybe not talked about Switzerland more, but Austria, but between the EU law, about the national law, plus then a cross-border law. And I think this makes things far too complex. I don't think this is something that we actually need. What we have to talk about more is this idea of, instead of talking about law, maybe talk more about competences. And in fact, the Treaty of Aachen between France and Germany has a chapter on cross-border cooperation where they talk about give the Euro districts or Euro regions competences and financial means to implement cross-border activities. That would be already sufficient. You do not necessarily, if you need the law, then you can either have a bilateral treaty between the states, which has been done in the border regions. We have bilateral treaties, for example, in this border region for the prevention of natural catastrophes. There has been a cross-border convention. So we do have that tool, or we have the European tool, and I believe this is sufficient. If we do have the European mechanisms on top of this, that would be perfect.
Thank you, Birte, for this brilliant analysis. We are at the end of the interview, but I have still some questions for you. You spoke about the multi-level governance. That will be the focus of our next question. Governance is a process of collective action, decision-making, and also a system of regulation. In 1977, a Canadian scholar used the term governance instead of government to indicate that we are referring to all institutional structures and processes having an impact on the making of public policy, not only the governmental institutions. And let's now speak about this multi-level governance concept. You spoke about that in the introduction of this podcast, but I want to have more details about the complexity and the possibilities of doing this kind of multi-level governance. And I interpret this multi-level governance as a new phase of the history of cross-border cooperation. So what could be the impact and what are the impact of this notion of multi-level governance to shape or to make cross-border cooperation more simple or more intelligible? Could you say some words about that?
Yeah, I don't think that multi-level governance makes cross-border cooperation more simple. It's probably making it more complex, but it's still a good idea because the idea of multi-level governance is a theoretical idea. As I have explained this a little bit beforehand, it's in fact this idea that decisions should not be taken only by one level of governance or government, but should be taken by different actors or different levels of governance in function of their competences and, if possible, the closest to the citizens. It's multi-level governance is also an idea to associate the people, the citizens, to either European integration or to cross-border cooperation. Multi-level governance is not exclusively used for the cross-border cooperation, but it's also used for in the European Union, trying to divide tasks between the EU level in Brussels, the national states, and the regions, and then also the people. And so if we apply this on the cross-border region, it means that we have, since we have so many actors, which I have spoken about at the beginning of this podcast, we have the local authorities, we have the regional authorities, we have also some cross-border institutions, we have the citizens, we have the private actors. So the idea of multi-level governance is to find a way in which these multiple actors can be associated to the cross-border decision-making process and maybe also the cross-border activities. This is not easy, and it's also it's quite complex, and it's difficult to find a governance system which takes into account all actors. We have tried this, if I may use our own border region here. We have tried to put this into place, this multi-level governance, because historically we have a lot of different governance structures. We had on the local level the Euro districts, then we had on the regional level the Upper Rhine Conference. We also had some parallel structures, the associations, the Regio Basiliensis, for example. And then we also have a lot of the cross-border projects that are implemented by the Interreg structures. So we had all these different actors in this region, and what they have tried to do is find a system of multi-level governance with pillars, which they have identified: an economic pillar, a pillar for the civil society, a political pillar, and a pillar for the scientific cooperation. And in these pillars, they try to find a kind of way how they interact and that they communicate with each other when cross-border activities are undertaken. That's called the metropolitan region. And the political pillar actually introduces the idea to have a multi-level governance between the local and the regional level, and then also to communicate with the EU level, and since the COVID crisis, also with the national level of governance. This is all very beautiful, and if you look at the scheme, it looks perfect. But in reality, it is very difficult to put into place because, in fact, the pillars do not necessarily communicate with each other. The economic pillar is rather independent. Private actors not necessarily interact with the political actors. The civil society is always difficult to associate to cross-border cooperation. The scientific world is also a specific world, so it's not easy to introduce multi-level governance in the border region. What does function, however, and I think this is extremely important, is we do have, since the Interreg programs, a very good multi-level governance between the European Commission for the programs of the regional policy programs, the Interreg programs, a very good multi-level structure where we have the Commission plus the member states who define the programs, and then in the regions we have the secretariats, and the political governance of these Interreg programs, and they communicate with the states, but they communicate also with the European Union. The European Commission comes in the regions to have a look at the projects, and I think that multi-level governance for Interreg actually functions really well. It's a good, maybe a good best practice example, even if I know that Interreg is often very criticized as being very administrative and not easy to manage, but the governance of Interreg, I think, is quite well thought in terms of multi-level approach of governance.
Thank you, Birte, for all these precious informations. You were able, in some of your articles, to describe cross-border cooperation as territorial diplomacy, and even as a small foreign policy. What do you call, Birte, what do you call territorial diplomacy? What is it?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and it has, if you like, it would take hours to actually define what really territorial diplomacy is. Do you have to say territorial diplomacy? Do you have to say diplomacy of the territories, or do you have to say small foreign policy or secondary foreign policy, or some also say para-diplomacy? These are all terms that designate, in fact, a foreign policy that is practiced not by the national states, but by infranational actors. That's the overall approach to all these this terminology. Territorial diplomacy has been more introduced in the European framework, and also especially in France, because it's linked to the idea of collectivité territoriale, meaning, local and regional authorities that are on a certain territory. That's why it's called territorial diplomacy. It means it's from the territories. It's a limited territory where you do diplomacy, and the territories, if you say collectivité territoriale, it can be towns, cities, regions, and it's this is why it's kind of specifically aimed for these local and regional authorities. And territorial diplomacy is used in with the purpose of cooperating with actors across the border. It doesn't have to be cross-border cooperation, can also be territorial diplomacy, can also be interregional. You can also do that between regions that are not separated by the same border. Doesn't necessarily have to be cross-border, it can be interregional. And it means that you use, in fact, political links, political relationships, that you engage in informal or more formal discussions about common problems, about cross-border problems, about common objectives also. For example, in a cross-border region, let's together fight for the protection of the environment of our border region. That can be an objective. And you can use diplomacy towards the European Union, for example, to do lobbying in favor of, obtaining money for your cross-border projects. But you can also use the territorial diplomacy for your neighbor. For example, the French region can try and convince the German region to go into rather this or that direction of to convince the neighbor to adopt a view from the French side, or vice versa. It means, in fact, it's like doing a foreign policy by the Quai d'Orsay on a regional and local level. That's a territorial diplomacy. What it is not done against the national state. I have mentioned this with in our publications with Martin Klatt. We have also talked about secondary foreign policy, because territorial diplomacy is used very much in the French context. But even secondary foreign policy means we are using this diplomacy not to destabilize or to go against the national state. We want to just deal with local affairs in between us and do foreign policy in between us, or do something together, fight for something like some financial support by the European Union, but not against the national foreign policy of our national states. That's the main characteristic of territorial diplomacy.
Thank you, Birte. With your lens of historian, what are the factors, the most important factors for a good cross-border cooperation between local actors? Is it the sharing the same culture, or is it the factor of economy, or is the factor of the differences between each local borderlands? What are the main factors to create to nourish a good or a very good cross-border cooperation?
That's also a very interesting question. I think you probably cannot generalize because it depends on each border region. But I would say that for all border region, what's necessary is you have to find a common interest in cross-border cooperation. You have to find also a common willingness to engage in cross-border cooperation. And the common interest can be an economic interest, for example, of facilitating cross-border work because it will benefit to one or the other region. And that cross-border work might actually be easier if you have a differential of the economic situation, or if you have different specializations of the region. That doesn't mean that you have to have equal economic regions. Then in most cases, you have more cross-border workers when you have differences in the regional development of border regions. That can be an economic interest. It can also be a political interest. For example, if you take Northern Ireland, I mean, if you want the common interest is to maintain peace or to re-establish peace, and so cross-border cooperation, cross-border relations are built or are initiated for the purpose not of economic development but of appeasement of the political situation. It can also have a cultural interest, can be a cultural interest. For example, when you look at the Catalan region, the Catalans have a very specific regional culture, and they share it with the French side on the other border, and so their interest can be to valorize this common regional identity with cross-border cooperation. So you see, it's not so easy to say. Is there more interest when you are different, or is there more interest when you have a common culture? It can be both. It depends. But what's necessary is you have to have a common interest. And what's also necessary is that you have to have the capacity and the to do cross-border cooperation. If you and that can be already very physical. If you have a cross-border region which is separated by a mountain and you don't have a tunnel, then it is very difficult to have, even you might have a lot of common interests, but if you cannot meet, then you will not be able to do cross-border cooperation. So there are also geographical factors that facilitate cross-border cooperation. A big mountain, a big sea is, or well, a river is not so difficult to cross, but still you have to cross it. You have to have a bridge. Geographical factors are also important. And then there are also, of course, the historical factors. That's always a very important factor in cross-border cooperation. The historical factors can be factors of common shared past, regional past, but it can also be conflict that you want to overcome. In the case of France and Germany, for example, it's a process of reconciliation, and you can have that also between Eastern and Western Europe after the end of the Cold War, so East-West reconciliation. These can also be motives for cross-border cooperation.
Thank you, Birte, for this overview about the different factors which could help the cross-border relations. My last question is about the globalization process and the global turn. Some people talk about global history or global international relations. What have been the effects of globalization in the field of international relations? And do cross-border cooperation relations and institutions have a place in this recent field of research?
Well, the globalization, I mean, when you talk about international relations and globalization, you talk about global factors that have an effect worldwide, and that, for example, I mean, this is generally to also state that the national states are no longer on their own capable of dealing with certain factors, climate protection, or even in the economic field, or even talking about certain threats like international terrorism, or certain crises like migration. That's also a global factor. These global factors that affect the national states, of course, affect also the regions. And so this field is extremely important for the cross-border cooperation, because you can say that in the modern world, because of globalization, the international relations are no longer the exclusive right of the national states in bilateral or multilateral diplomacy. It's an affair which concerns a multitude of different actors, not only cross-border regions, but regional actors, also the civil society. You have also ONGs that are very active in international relations nowadays. So you have these multitude of actors, and they can all contribute to deal with these global factors. And this is a chance for the cross-border regions to claim also their utility in international relations.
Thank you, Birte. Last question, but not least, what is the future of cross-border cooperation? I know you're a historian, you're more focused on the past, but could we imagine a future, is my last question, a future of the next trends of cross-border cooperation? Just a quick synthesis.
The future of cross-border cooperation is, this is a challenging question for a historian. I think that cross-border cooperation is, if we talk about Europe, is still a field which can and will develop enormously. We have seen from the maps of Interact that the spaces of concerned and the people concerned by cross-border projects have grown. I think this tendency will continue, and that that the more cross-border projects and activities you will lead in Europe, the more this will become a field that is concerning everyone in the end in the European Union. So cross-border cooperation has started as a minor phenomenon at the margin by some people who've engaged in cross-border relations, and now it becomes a centerpiece, in fact, of the lived integration, European integration by the people in the European Union. This is very important. Also, I think the place of cross-border cooperation in the European Union will also continue to increase, because with growing Euroscepticism and with these international crises, there will be more and more the necessity for the European Union to focus on the lower level of governance. They will have to associate the towns and the regions for their policies in order to bring Europe down to the territories. And cross-border cooperation is also one occasion to be able to do this. And in the past, I mean, the cross-border regions have been sometimes identified as either models or testing places for European integration. And I think this will continue and will be even increased in the future. The European Union has already shown that they put more and more emphasis on these cross-border regions, because they increase the cohesion policy, the funding that is given to these regions, and it will also become more important geopolitically, because when you look at the recent crisis in Ukraine, for example, you see that in fact those who deal with, for example, Ukrainian refugees, it's, well, first of all, where do they come to? They come to the border region in Poland. They come to the towns there, and so you can see there the importance of the local in these European crises, and you can see the necessity also to associate these actors, local and regional actors, not only for I would say the nice cross-border economic cooperation, but also for the difficult geopolitical cooperation. You can, and I think this will probably with the global factors and with the growing uncertainty in Europe, I think that the key for maintaining cohesion and maintaining also the European mobility is the cross-border cooperation. So that's my idea. I think it will be something which will gain still more and more importance in the policies in the Europe as a policy in the European Union, and it will also get more and more recognized by the national states, because I think the problem was more in the past on the national states than in the European Union, and I think the national states will increasingly have to deal with the fact that the cross-border regions are specific places and very crucial ones for this future of the European Union.
Thank you, Birte. And I think this dynamism of cross-border relations by local authorities, I think it's also at the global scale. We could notice a huge development of these cross-border relations all around the world. And I remember an article of Emmanuel Brunet-Javi about the global overview of cross-border cooperation in 2022 last year. And I think it's important to have that in mind, this big picture, multi-level of cross-border cooperations, complexity with different actors, with different factors, with different processes, always the notion of subsidiarity to create at the local level what should be created at the local level. And of course, each border is very different than another. So the context is very also important. So thank you very much, Birte Wassenberg, for participating in our podcast series. It was an amazing and great discussion on cross-border cooperation and this very, very rich history. So a big thank you, Birte.
It was my pleasure. Merci. My pleasure. Merci,
Merci, Birte. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Today we were with Birte Wassenberg. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.